And we're going to go, like I mentioned last time, we're going to go back to Daniel chapter 7, and about Daniel's dream with these four beasts. I wanted to go back and look at these in more detail and compare notes with what we studied in Revelation. I don't know, I didn't write the date down on when we were in this part of Revelation, but it's been a while. But it was through our study in Revelation that we talked about these same four beasts. And if you want to turn there, and we'll be going there next to Revelation chapter 12, the end of chapter 12, chapter 13, and also chapter 17. So those will be the two places we'll look at in Revelation as we get into this. And remember, the book of Daniel was closed. Daniel tells us that in the last chapter, he was told to close the book. And the book of Daniel was not fully understood by God's people until the book of Revelation was written by John, the revelation of Jesus Christ, if you want to put it that way. That's what it's referred to in many circles, and I think is a good title, because it is the revelation. Our Lord begins the book by talking to John and laying things out for him. So it is the Lord's revealing to John the future. Now, the book of Daniel, of course, was written primarily to the Jews, to Israel, to God's chosen people of Israel. God's chosen nation, I should say, Israel. And the things that they would be dealing with. Many of the things in Daniel, as far as prophecy, won't have much to do with the Lord's churches. And some people don't understand that, but it's a fact. You look at the different dreams, Nebuchadnezzar's dreams, Nebuchadnezzar, the statue that he dreamed of, and some of the other things Daniel dreams of, these four beasts. Some of these things, like the statue, are marks of historical data to us today. Those kingdoms have come and gone for the most part, other than the iron and the clay feet and toes. Those, I believe, are still around today and will present themselves even more so in the tribulation as the Roman Empire continues on. And some will say, well, the Roman Empire ended so many hundreds of years ago. Well, if you want to get down to the matter, the Roman Empire has continued on through Roman Catholicism. And it's very evident. Roman Catholicism, whether they want to admit it or not, is an empire. Its head is the Pope. And the Pope in Rome, in the Vatican City, he controls much of what goes on in the world today, even. It used to be more evident what he controlled, because you saw more of what he controlled. Today, much of what people, you go to talking about these things and people will call you a conspiracy theorist. But there are things that go on behind the scenes with governments around the world that we don't know about, things that we don't see. And I don't encourage you to go out there and go to YouTube and do a mass research on this junk, because it's what it is. A lot of people have their own ideas, and whether it's true or not, I have no idea. A lot of them try to base their theories and all that on biblical principles, and a lot of times they don't match. And people fall for it. and God's people fall for it. Be careful of those things. For one, a lot of the things that are brought out, we see from the so-called religious world out there, so-called Christianity, that we have to be careful about. Everybody talks about the end times today and about what's going on in the end times. And yes, we are in the end times. We are in the last days. That's evident. But there are a lot of things that are not even going to come about until the tribulation period. The mark of the beast is not going to come about in our lifetime. So why worry about it? You know, people are worried, well, the vaccines that are out there are the mark of the beast. Or I remember when I was very young, the barcode system that was going on products in the grocery store was going to be the mark of the beast. You were going to have a barcode stamped on your hand or embedded in your hand that was going to be the mark of the beast. When they came out with, well, each identification label or whatever, it's come out since then. There's something new. It's a little square with a bunch of little squiggly lines in it. I can't remember what those are. UFID chips, I think is what they're called. I've had to deal with them before at places I've worked, and they're a way to track packages, to track products, similar to a barcode, but it's much more detailed. And so you can scan it, and a computer, if it's got the right program in it, can tell you exactly what that chip says, and that was going to be the mark of the beast when it first came out. Everybody was scared of it. I can remember, even in the workplace where I was at the time, people that weren't Christian were worried it was going to be the mark of the beast. The mark of the beast, these things may be leading up to it, don't misunderstand me, but it's not the mark of the beast, not yet. We're not going to be here when it comes, so why worry about it? We're not looking for the Antichrist. You know, there are people out there they spend their whole lifetime trying to guess who the Antichrist is going to be. And do they have it right? I don't know. I don't think they don't know for sure. I think when he comes on the scene, I think if we are able to see it, I think we're going to be surprised at who he is. Because I don't think he's going to be who everybody thinks he is. And that's my opinion. But we're not looking for him. We're looking for the return of our Savior. And as one of the Lord's churches, we're looking forward to the return of our bridegroom. The bridegroom is coming, and that's who we need to be looking for. That's who we're preparing for. All throughout the Scripture, the Lord is giving examples and telling the church, be ready for the return of the bridegroom. So, now to get back on topic here, with these four beasts, we don't need to worry about these four beasts, for one, because we're not going to be here when they come. Why did the Lord show Daniel these four beasts in the dream? Because the nation of Israel will have to worry about them. Because there are going to be people in the tribulation when the Lord brings the nation of Israel back together during that time, and he saves a nation in a day. And remember, we studied in the Revelation where 144,000 are going to be saved. And you're going to have the two witnesses that are going to come and preach the gospel to the whole world through whatever means. We don't have a clue what it is. There's another topic that we could get off on, that people down through the ages have made all kinds of guesses at it, how they're going to be able to communicate throughout the whole world. Only the Lord knows how that's going to happen. So why worry about it? So Daniel's dream, if you remember, takes place in the first year of Belshazzar. He tells us that in verse 1 of chapter 7. Belshazzar, if you remember, was the son of Nebuchadnezzar. He didn't rule for very long, just a few years, and then the Medes and the Persians came in and overthrew the kingdom. Daniel had a vision at night. He says, the four winds of the heaven strove upon the great sea. the four winds, in other words, a storm was coming. A storm, and many times a storm on the sea, especially you think about a hurricane, the winds can come from any direction, and depending on where you're at, and especially if you're close to the eye of the hurricane, the winds could be coming from all four directions, depending on where you're at. And the Great Sea that he talks about here, obviously, is the Mediterranean. That in their day, the Great Sea that they knew about was the Mediterranean Sea. And remember, Daniel, unless he saw the Mediterranean when he was a child still in Jerusalem, he would have never seen the Mediterranean Sea. He's only heard about it. Maybe he has seen it in visions when the Lord has brought him a vision. There are other dreams and visions that Daniel had that are not written down. That's pretty obvious from the way he talks. But he talks about these four beasts in verse 3. And four great beasts came up from the sea, diverse, one from another. In other words, they were different from each other. And notice he says four great beasts. They're not small, they're large, they're scary, they're mean looking. The first one was like a lion and had eagle's wings. I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth and made stand upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. In our study in Revelation, chapter 13, we discovered that the first beast was like a lion with wings of eagles. If you turn to to Revelation, and we'll keep our finger there in Revelation chapter 13. And John says, and I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 heads, or 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. But let me skip down. It's okay. In verse 2, and the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the. Let's see. Is that where I wanted to start? Well, I've lost my place now. Well, it's just going. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority. And I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death. Okay, we're getting a little further ahead in my notes than I wanted to get. But back in these 10 crowns that he talks, or these 10 horns that he talks about. If you go back to Daniel chapter 7, and he talks about these 4 beasts. And so, I'm sorry, I skipped ahead in my notes on Revelation. Let's go back to the 4 beasts. That's a little further in our notes. The first beast is like a lion with the wings of an eagle, which represents Babylon. And you look at the mascot of Babylon, and up until 1959, it was represented on the coat of arms of Iraq, the nation of Iraq. So it was the first beast that Daniel describes is a picture of, or a representative of, the nation of Babylon, the kingdom of Babylon, specifically Nebuchadnezzar. because he was like a lion, and he had eagle's wings. In other words, he moved fast, he moved quickly. And remember, he quickly took over a great part of the world in his day. And he says, and behold, verse 5, and behold, another beast, a second, like to a bear, and it raised up itself on one side, and it had 3 ribs in the mouth of it, between the teeth of it, and they said thus unto it, arise, devour much flesh. And so the second beast is like a bear, represented as the Medo-Persian Empire. In history, the bear is shown to have a ferocious appetite, as did the Medo-Persian Empire. They weren't, neither the Babylonian Empire and the Medo-Persian Empire, neither one were nice guys, if you're going to put it that way. They were very cruel people, but the Medo-Persian Empire had a ferocious appetite. In other words, they went after more. They weren't just satisfied with what they had conquered with Babylon. They went after more. And they strove to conquer much more than even the Babylonians did. If you look in Daniel 7, verse 6, after this I beheld, and lo, another like a leopard, which had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl. The beast had also 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. So the third beast in verse 6 is a leopard, representative of the empire of Greece, specifically Alexander the Great. They moved quickly like a leopard and took over that part of the world. The Grecian Empire sprang up quickly. Alexander moved with great speed to conquer most of the former Medo-Persian Empire and more. And you look in that part of the world, and even today, I know some things have been destroyed and moved around for, especially the Muslims have come in and destroyed a lot of what's called antiquity, the monuments and the statues and all that of antiquity. There was a time not long ago, less than 100 years ago, when you went to different parts of the world over there, you saw cities named after Alexander, Alexandria, Egypt, and there's other places that were named Alexandria. There were remnants of large cities that the Grecian Empire had built. There were monuments, there were temples to their false gods all over the place. And they conquered much more in a very quick time, much more than the Medo-Persians did. They were all over North Africa. They were all over the Middle East. They were all over what was once Persia, Iraq, and Iran, and as far east as some say India, and the southern parts of China, and then when as far west as not just Greece, but even into Rome, some say, and the parts of Italy. But he wasn't the most powerful. And remember, Alexander only lived a short time. He was in his middle to late 30s when he passed away. And so he died fairly young, and he was replaced by 4 of his top generals who eventually lost the empire. They squandered everything. They weren't the leaders that Alexander had been. And eventually they lost to the Romans. And so the 4th beast, verse 7, after this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth. It devoured and brake in pieces and stamped the residue from the feet of it. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. It was different than the other 4 beasts. But it had combined some of the things of the other 3 beasts. It resembled some of the things of the other 3 beasts, but it was also different. And the 4th beast in Daniel's dream would be none other than the Roman Empire, which was the great empire to come after that. You don't hear much about empires anymore. And people say, well, what about the empires of places like China and Russia and India and those, Japan and places like that? We don't hear about those empires in the Bible. Well, these are concerning the things of the Middle East. These are the things surrounding the Holy Land, if you want to call it that, the land of Palestine, the Promised Land. These are the ones who, in their day, affected that part of the world and will once again affect that part of the world in the days to come. But the fourth beast, the Roman Empire, and you notice the fourth beast is not described as a particular animal. It doesn't, the other two, there was the lion and the bear and the leopard, but the fourth one is not described as an animal. What does he say? A fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth. It devoured and brake in pieces and stamped the residue with the feet of it. Doesn't tell us what this beast was like, what it looked like. It doesn't compare it to anything else, to any animal. But a beast with 10 horns. The same beast we see in Revelation 13. So if you turn over to Revelation 13, and he says, and the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority. What's he talking about there? This Roman Empire, this beast that doesn't resemble any other animal, or doesn't resemble an animal, takes on the other empires. It takes on the personification or the aspects of the other empires. If you study the Roman Empire, they were nothing more but a mimic of the former empires. If you look at Greek and Roman mythology, Greek mythology, of course, coming first. The Roman mythology coming second. Roman mythology just mimicked what the Greeks did. The gods, they're false gods with each one had a different thing that he did, superpower, whatever you want to call it. They just changed their names. They all had the same thing. Had a god to the same thing, but each one was just named different. They both had their top god. They had Jupiter and Zeus were the two top gods in those two religions. But also Rome became a haven for the Chaldean priest. And we've talked about that before. The Chaldean priest, the Medes and Persians ran them out of Babylon. After they took over the kingdom, they ran them out. One reason is because they were very powerful in the kingdom, and they didn't want them around and a lot of them were killed. You study history on that time period, and you see where a lot of those Chaldean priests were killed because the Medo-Persians didn't want them threatening the new empire. And so they were run out of the empire, of the area of their homeland. Also know that Nebuchadnezzar in his day built, we know what the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, supposed to be, from what's written, the most beautiful place on earth. And it was the Babylonians, it was in some places it's referred to as the New Eden. They try to compare it to what God had created in Genesis, and of course it wasn't that beautiful, but it was a very beautiful place. And then they also had a great library there, and supposedly in that library were books from all over the world that they had gathered up. They had traveled the world over and gathered up volumes of books and writings and parchments to every nation that they could come across around the world. And some say, and you, if you reference some of Catholicism's history, they claim that some of those very writings and books that they had at the Great Library in Babylon could be traced back to some of the descendants of Noah. And so some of those books actually contained stories that were passed down from Noah and his sons and their families, telling of things that happened before the flood. Is that impossible? No, it's not. Is that what really happened? We don't know. That's one of those things that, and people talk about conspiracy theories. Here's one for you. Supposedly, and I wish I had documented, I had written it down, but there is references to this in Roman Catholicism history, in their own history books in the Vatican, that tell that those books, some of those books from the Chaldean priest were brought to Rome. And maybe before next time, because I want to come back and finish this study on chapter 7 next time, but maybe before next time I can look that up and find it for you and get the reference. But they brought these books that had been written about things that had happened before the flood, about religion, about how things were, how people were, what they did, what their life was like. All those things were brought, and even the false gods and the false religions that were there before then. And some say that because of that, the wickedness that you see very soon after the flood, after Noah dies and his sons and their generations begin, you begin to see the world getting more wicked again. Man's sin comes to head again, and you have the Tower of Babel. It's one of the first stories we see, where men had become so wicked they thought they could build a tower up to God. And how ridiculous is that? You look up into the sky, and just looking up, you can say, well, that's impossible. But they were so wicked they thought they could do it. They had no concept of how high God really is. I guess I don't know what they were thinking, but God separated the people at that point, separated their languages. They couldn't talk to each other. So if you've ever been on a construction site where you got different workers with different languages, it's very difficult to get something done. And so that's how it was in that day. God confused the languages, and they couldn't finish the tower. Now, remember the Tower of Babel, of course, would have been the city of Babel, I should say, would have been, and remember Nimrod was one of Noah's grandsons or great-grandsons down the line, was the first to build a city in the area of Babylon. And it was it was the city of Babel. That's where some say that Babylon gets its name, is from the city of Babel. We know the Romans took on many of the traditions of the peoples they conquered. They still do today. The Roman Catholicism has done the same thing. They have taken on many of the traditions of the people they have conquered. You look at some of the things we see that we can think of. We look at Mardi Gras. That's not for another 6 months or so. It's in February or March, and the celebration they have. We know notoriously the main celebration takes place in New Orleans, Louisiana, every year. And you look at that and you think, well, how hideous is that? But there are other celebrations that are for the same thing that take place in different countries. You take like Brazil, they have something that is very similar to Mardi Gras, but it's even much more dark. Uh, and so each place they conquered, they tried to Christianize, was what they called it. Um, their holidays, their religious beliefs, and so they instituted, they intermingled different religious beliefs in with their own, and so that's how these holidays like Mardi Gras come about. Today it has become, people. I've known people that was like their life goal was to get to go to Mardi Gras in New Orleans, and I'm like, why? For one, there's always someone getting killed down there during that time. It's nothing but a porn fest, from what I understand. I've never been and don't plan to go, but you listen to people who have been there, and it's open nudity. It's open. Just the parade itself is hideous, and it's a drunk fest, drugs, prostitution. How is that religious? How is that Christian? How can you call that have anything to do with Christ, with something like that? But Roman Catholicism promotes it. And you notice in a city where Roman Catholicism is prominent, they don't try to put a stop to it. If anybody could, the Roman Catholic priests in that area could shut Mardi Gras down overnight. They could say, okay, no more, it's against the Bible. They don't try. They never have. They go along with it because it's part of their religion. So not only did the Romans absorb the Chaldean priest and their religious beliefs and false gods, but they also took on the Medo-Persians, their false gods. We don't hear much about the Medo-Persians and their false gods, but they did. They had their own false gods that were somewhat different than the ones in Chaldea and the ones in Babylon. But the Romans also took on theirs and the Greeks. Now, most of what we see, or what we saw a few years ago, when ISIS was destroying things over in Iraq and in Syria and some other places over there, those were leftovers from the Babylonian Empire and a lot of it from the Medo-Persian Empire. If you watch those events on the news, they told those things. They said, well, this was from this time period, and they would tell what empire those were left over from. Some were even left over from the Greeks when they had controlled that area. Many of the statues found around the former Roman Empire are actually older than the Roman Empire itself. If you go to the Vatican, and some of the statues that are there in the Vatican, they're not from the Roman Empire. They're older than that. They were either moved there or they were left there by whoever was there before, but they were originally statues and monuments to Greek gods, Medo-Persian gods, Babylonian gods, and as we mentioned before, true to Roman Catholicism form, they took and Christianized even the statues. I'm trying to think the one that's the most popular that I've seen the most pictures of. I think it was the statue of, I can't remember if it was of David, King David, or if it was of John, the Apostle John, one of the two. Anyway, supposedly it's supposed to be of him, and it's a nude statue, which I don't think any of God's men would have posed for a nude statue. But in all reality, if you trace it back, you see that it was actually a Greek god. The statue was. It was originally a Greek god, and Roman Catholicism just changed the name. You can't do that. For one, we're supposed to have, we shouldn't be having nude statues to begin with. And especially, how does that honor a man of God? It doesn't. It's blasphemy to the Lord himself. And I've already talked about the Romans taking on the Greek gods. We know about all that. So the Roman Empire would take on the resemblance of the first three beasts mentioned in Daniel 7. The first beast mentioned, and the first beast mentioned in Revelation chapter 13. Turn over to Revelation chapter 13, verse 2. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority. So this is going to be the beast that's going to control things through the majority of the tribulation period. Notice he says the dragon is Satan, the devil, is going to give him his power and his seat and his great authority. He's going to have authority over who? Over all the world. There's going to be a one world religion, a one world political system, one world monetary system. We know about all those things. The dragon or Satan, and remember the beast and Satan, you're looking at the unholy trinity. This here in Revelation 13, there was two beasts mentioned, and the dragon is Satan, is the father figure, as God the Father is the father figure in the Holy Trinity. The first beast in verse 2 is the unholy spirit or false prophet. The second beast is the Antichrist or the son of Satan. The second beast being starting in verse 11, you see there. So Satan mimics everything God does. And if you look in chapter 13, Revelation 13, verse 11, and I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. So here you have horns like a lamb, but speaks as a dragon. He's going to look like an innocent lamb, but he's actually going to be a dragon. He appears as gentle as a lamb, but he speaks lies like the dragon. He is the human personification of Satan himself, is what some say. He even performs miracles, as Christ did. If you go on and read that, we've already studied that in Revelation, we won't go any further into that. But back in Daniel chapter 7, Daniel's dream, he says in, verse 8, I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were three of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of man, and a mouth speaking great things. There's been all kinds of speculations on who this little horn is. I don't remember if y'all remember Yasser Arafat. You know, he was the leader of the Palestinian, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, for years. You know, he had a knot on his head, on his forehead, and even he laughed about it and claimed that he was the little horn mentioned in Daniel. And Christians believed that for a long time, that he was going to be the little horn. Even when he was in old age, they believed he was going to be the little horn. Well, obviously now he's not, because he's no longer here. That's the kinds of things that you have to be careful about. And I warn people about, especially about the things we watch on YouTube. and not just YouTube, but things we see on social media as a whole. There's a lot of garbage out there, and you have to be careful. I caution you about going and listening to people who are not of like faith in particular, because if they don't understand, for one, the doctrines of grace as the Bible teaches, and if they don't understand the teachings on the Lord's church as the Bible teaches, they're going to get it wrong 99% of the time. They're not going to be right on. They may get a few things right, but they're going to be wrong on a lot of stuff. As I've mentioned when we did our study in Revelation, the book of Revelation was written to the churches, not to the rest of the world, not to the rest of Christianity, not to the rest of the religious world, those saved who are outside the Lord's churches. It was written to the Lord's churches. He tells us that in the first few chapters. And as we get to the end of the book, he reiterates that book was written to the churches. It is the Lord showing his bride what's going to happen after she leaves, after he comes back and takes her out, and then what's going to happen. Well, he starts off telling what's going to happen. He mentions there in Revelation about the church at Ephesus. He threatens to take the candlestick away from them. He gives us examples of what was wrong with some of those churches in the first century, and he reminds the churches, don't be this way. Then there are some of those churches that he compliments on the things that they're doing right, and those are the things that we're to look at. Those are the examples we are to follow. There are things, and then when he stops writing to the churches, there was only 7 letters to those 7 churches. Were those the only 7 churches in that day? I don't think so. I mean, when you look at the book of Acts and you look at the letters that Paul wrote to churches, there were other churches, but he instructed those churches to send those letters to the other churches. Those 7 churches were the examples the Lord gave of what not to do and what to do and what not to do. And then when the Lord came back and took his people out, you see, or when he comes back and takes his people out of here, you see what happens after. He shows the churches, this is what's going to happen during the 7 years that you're out of the picture. And you don't see anything about the church again until you get towards the end of the book, to the last few chapters, and then he begins to talk about the bride and about the church. And so if you notice in the book of Daniel, you don't see those things. Why? Because Daniel, it was written to the Jews to prepare them for what was to come during the tribulation. Why? Because there are going to be Jews that are going to be saved during the tribulation. There are going to be some Gentiles too. Revelation is clear on that. But certainly the main focus is going to be on Israel. God's going to save a nation in a day. And those people he's going to hide in the mountains and hide them from the armies of Satan and protect them there until he comes and destroys the army at the Battle of Armageddon. Now back in Daniel 7, he said, I beheld, verse 9, I beheld till the thrones were cast down, and the Ancient of Days did sit. The Ancient of Days being the Lord himself. God the Father is the Ancient of Days here. Whose garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head like the pure wool. His throne was like the fiery flame, and his wheels as burning fire. A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. Thousands ministered unto him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him, and judgment was set, and the books were opened. What judgment is this? This is the final judgment that leads to the final death, the second death, if you will. This is where those who will be judged will be cast into the lake of fire. There's going to be a very large number of people who are going to be judged. And he says, and there's going to be some that in this life, they never thought they would be there. They thought they were going to make it through And there's people that think that the Lord has saved them. They'll find out different. He says, I beheld then because of the voice of the great words which the horn spake, I beheld even till the beast was slain and his body destroyed and given to the burning flame. Which beast is he talking about here? The last beast, the fourth beast. And if you remember, in Revelation, the beast will be destroyed. The world turns on the Pope, the one world religion, whatever you want to call it, because at that time they're still preaching some semblance of Christ. It's not the truth, of course, but they're still a representative, or think they're a representative of God and of Christ, and even as they are now, they're not. But all that's going to come to an end. I'm going to stop there for tonight because we've got quite a bit more to cover in Daniel 7. We're going to look more at these 10 kings, these 10 horns that he talks about. There's some other things I want to look at. We'll look at those things next time. So we're going to stop there, and we'll get through, or should get through, the rest of this study on chapter 7 next time. But I want to stop there because we're fixing to get into a lot more detail. So we'll stop there for tonight.